So welcome everybody. It's a great occasion for us that we have this session. Dr. George knows that I've been nagging him about this probably almost somewhere between 9 months to a year. So and of course the pandemic came in the middle and sort of made things a little bit more difficult. But we're very pleased to host Dr. George with us tonight. So this is a topic that I believe that many people feel is important to discuss, to listen, to see what is the perspective. And I personally, not being an expert, I always told people I have no biological, any kind of medical, any kind of anything to do with biology background. So these are some of the things that sometimes you feel that you have to be sort of well gauged in the sciences to deal with this. So we're very fortunate that we have someone like Dr. George in our community who was able to really do a very good deep dive into this. So a quick introduction for those who might not know him. Dr. George was born and raised in England, and then he later relocated with his family back to Egypt, where he finished his medical degree in '96. A year later, he immigrated to the US and completed his medical training at the University of Minnesota. And this is where he currently resides in Minnesota. He's an interventional cardiologist, and he's an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. Dr. George's interests are very wide and cover a very wide range of church ministries, which we are very thankful for. A lot of people know him through his work in SIMANA, the Coptic Medical Association of North America, and Africa and Latin America medical missions. And a lot of people do always speak of the great experience they have with using their talents to those people in need. But besides Dr. George's other ministries, which he includes youth campus ministry and all that, regular church ministries, he has found the time, besides that, plus his family of his wife and his 3 kids, all of them who are in their late teens, which is a great feat and a crown of martyrdom, at least. He decided that he needed to put some more effort into researching several aspects of the faith. So, and to that end, he decided, as if, in a community of Coptic overachievers, as if being a doctor isn't enough. So he's done a Master's of Theology at the University of Winchester in the UK, and then a Master's in Biblical Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, and then a Master's in Christian Apologetics at Biola University. And about a year ago, or a year and a half or so, he had enrolled in a PhD program as well. And the big focus for him has been the Old Testament and biblical apologetics. And he currently also teaches at our Coptic Seminary in Los Angeles. And I was very happy to attend his class at the Introduction of the Old Testament, which was really quite enlightening. So thank you so much, Dr. George, for joining us tonight. And we'll leave it to you. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Abuna. Thank you, Abuna Theodore. Abuna Pavlos, Halilni. Please bless Abuna.
In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen.
Thank you. So, first of all, I want to thank you for this invitation. Chicago is a very, very close and dear to my heart. There's so many familiar names and faces, and not just like in terms of mission, but actually, a lot of good friends on this list. So hello to everyone. I'm not going to go through one by one, but just not to take too much time, but just want to tell all of you that we as family miss seeing you. So in tonight's, I don't want to take a lot of time because I won't actually take more time to questions. But within this half hour, it's going to be very hard to tackle all the topics in half an hour. And that's one of the reasons why the main thing for this talk is just opening some ideas and different ways of thinking. I've been studying this for the last probably 15 plus years. And the more and more I study about it, I believe that our biggest problem, both from a society perspective as well as a faith perspective, is not necessarily the facts, but it's rather how we process the facts. And I think that's where a lot of people are caught in the middle. This debate between science and faith, you get people who are, it's kind of interesting that they had their peak about maybe 10 years ago, the 3, or they call the 4 dark horses of atheism. But Richard Dawkins very famous professor in the UK, and he's considered like the arch, bishop or the pope of the atheists. And he's one who's actually is called like a militant atheist. And for him, he kind of is the one who tried to spearhead this notion that the problem with religion in general, but Christianity, he picks specifically on Christianity because that's what he's most familiar with, that basically it's anti-intellectual. So he's the one that has been preaching to the crowd that being a Christian, you're basically anti-intellectual. You're giving up your ability to use reason. And he says, I'm against religion because it teaches us not to be satisfied with not understanding the world. And unfortunately, a lot of people fell for him. It's kind of, I find it very interesting that actually that wave is coming down, because there are a lot of people right now who realize that what Richard Dawkins is preaching is not matching with what we understand of what's called philosophy of science. He's a scientist, but he's not a philosopher. And that's where he fell quite a bit, from being, he's a popular guy, but actually when philosophers take him to debate, they can really critique his methodology and what he's coming up. But needless to say, why is there the debate? And I think the biggest part of the debate, and it's very interesting that we're coming from a very heated political kind of debate and the election. But what people are trying to get to is like, what is the truth? And Pilate asked that question to Christ. And in some sense, I believe in my heart that whether we're coming from a faith perspective or a scientific perspective, we're all trying to seek the truth. And the truth is essentially about a lot of existential things. For example, how did we exist to be here? Where did we come from? How do I know that after I'm going to die, I'm going to have some sort of connection with my wife and my 3 kids? To me, that could be a scientific question in terms of the existence of matter, the existence of a life after death. It is a question of faith, but it's also a question of truth. Okay, I don't want to be living a lie. And I think if we sometimes try to kind of step back from saying, well, is the Earth 10,000 years, or is the Earth, the universe is 14 to 15 billion years? I guess it comes back to the fundamental question that, yes, there are people like Richard Dawkins who are out there to get Christians and just portraying them in this picture that they're just dumb people who are rejecting science. But the reality, that's not the majority of scientists. In fact, I think that the majority of scientists are seeking truth. And I believe also a majority of us as faithful people, we're seeking truth. And we're seeking truth based on faith and understanding. One thing which I find very unique, and I've shared this maybe with some of you before, is that as you look, Barna is a group that does polling over years. And one thing that they really do cool is that they compare years over decades. So you can see trends. And when they look at the religious identity, they did this, I think this was ended in about 2016 or 2017, but it was published in 2018. And these are houses, by the way, the sample is from houses that identified themselves as Christian, okay? So the sample size is sample coming from people who are identified as Christians. And what they found that the agnostic and atheists, okay, those who identified out of this household as agnostic and atheist, doubled in a generation, over a decade. This was from their previous decade in 2008 survey to 2018. And this did raise a lot of alarm among people, because basically over one generation, you have doubled your number of people who come from households that are claimed to be Christian, and they're saying they identify themselves as an agnostic or an atheist. And when they went into a little bit of more details, why? What are the reasons? Okay, and these are the top reasons. I'm not gonna, so you find that this is like the top reasons for apologists. Okay, the problem of evil is very big on top. I think we have struggled as a church and as a faith to understand a little bit what is the meaning of this pandemic. Was this pandemic a judgment versus not? But the reality is that people around the world struggle with the faith because of the problem of evil. Christians are hypocrites. But when you look at actually the middle two, the middle two reasons are, science refused too much of the Bible, and I don't believe in fairy tales, which is basically I need facts, and the Bible doesn't have facts, so it's not good enough for me. The problem is that as you look at this, so here they kind of told them, like they try to categorize them, science versus faith, and here on one side in conflict, I'm on the side of science, and here in conflict, I'm on the side of the Bible. And then some who consider them completely independent. So basically on Sunday, I go to church, listen to what church tells me. The rest of the week, I go to the university, and I belong to the university. Can you, and this is really, so this is the generation we're dealing with, Gen Z and millennials, okay? Only a quarter of our sample size of the people that we serve think of science and faith as complementing parts of truth, complementing parts of reality, which to me, that I believe is where we should be, is that science and faith are integrated, okay? They're not independent. You cannot make them totally independent because there are some parts of understanding that you can make them independent. Either we have a post life after we die or we don't. So it's either this or that. Either we have a soul or we don't have a soul. So for me, I don't think they can be totally dependent. But what really bothers me is that 3/4 of the sample considered that science and faith are either in conflict or completely to be separated, and we're living almost like a bipolar life. And to me, that's really problematic, because if you think of our existence, if you think of our truth, if you think of our big questions of existence and life, if you think of science and faith as two domains of knowledge, and this is sometimes what people in the church almost like to kind of go back into a little bit of a security and feel, well, you know what, science cannot prove or disprove God, so then science and faith are independent. Well, it's like yes and no, because if you make them too independent, you've almost made them two separate domains of truth and existence, that now at this point, I'm obliged to live a bipolar life, a life on Sunday and a life on the rest of the week. But for me, I think this model is a bit more better representative of what it should be. That science and faith do bring certain aspects of truth, bring certain views on truth. In some parts, they are overlapping, okay? And this is a huge field of what's called natural theology. In some areas, they don't. In some areas, science, answers things that faith doesn't. So this is a model that I want to actually try to emphasize today a little bit. So in general, maybe, as I said, because I don't want to, I can't speak for a long period of time, so just half an hour, but I want to at least, start to tackle some myths and false facts about the debate between faith and science. And that would allow us then to ask some questions at the end of this session. The first myth is the myth of the battle. I think this myth has been, unfortunately, propagated from both sides of the aisle. It's been propagated very much by the scientific atheists, who are basically claiming that the church persecuted from the time of Galileo and persecuted science. They wanted to suppress science. They wanted to suppress natural discovery. They wanted to suppress investigation. And that's not the case. Actually, if any one of you goes and reads the historical records of the debate of Galileo, he was actually put on probation by the church, not because of his science, but because of how he tried to force his way of interpreting the Bible. The church at that time believed, that the Catholic Church, or the Catholic magisterium believed at that point, that biblical interpretation is only for the church people, the church hierarchy. And that's actually one of the reasons why the Reformation rejected the Catholic Church, because they felt at that time that the biblical interpretation should be allowed for even the laity. So the problem the Catholic Church had at that time was not primarily his science, but how he was trying to enforce also that he has the right to interpret the Bible. This battle has been played out of proportion by the scientific atheistic community, or the secular community, to basically depict that the whole time the church was anti-science or anti-truth or anti-investigation. And that's not the case. If you actually look at a lot of the pillars of modern science, a lot of them had a sense of actually trying to discover this because they actually believed in God, and believed in God as this superior, rational, intelligent being. Somebody like Johannes Kepler, okay, was a very devout Christian. In fact, when you look at somebody like, I think it was Mendel, Mendel was a monk. And for him, when he was looking at the genetic inheritance, he was looking at how this was a way that God was designing the world in a very unique fashion. So the reality is that as you look in the history of science, and there's so many books that talk about the history of science, the debate and the battle between faith and science is overplayed and overstated. The current debate, actually, and this is something that is very interesting, I've been seeing that probably within the last decade, And that's where I say that I think people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris overplayed their cards about 10 years ago. There is quite a move back in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of existence, actually against the like militant atheism of science, where basically science is saying, well, science proves that God doesn't exist. And a lot of scientists at this point are far more comfortable saying, well, I'm okay to be agnostic. I don't know. I don't think my science disproves God. I don't think my science disproves the existence of a soul. I don't think my science can actually tackle that. So a lot of top scientists at this point would rather remain agnostic. Yes, the percentage of scientists who are actually very faithful Christians are dwindling, or not dwindling, they're actually staying, but they're like not the majority. But it's hard to say that actually a lot of them are now like atheist or militant atheist. In fact, I always give the example of the head of the NIH, so the head of the top medical society or health society in the world that actually does all the health research. He's a very devout Christian, Francis Collins. He's one of the people that discovered the modern human genome. So very devout Christian, and the way that he brings Christ to the scientific arena is very admirable. So that's number one, that the battle is not the case. And I think this is one thing that, unfortunately, I see sometimes Christians, not maybe within us as Orthodox, but within fundamental evangelical Christians, who basically want to shield their sons and daughters from the barbs of this battle. So they try to portray the other side, these scientists. When you go to college, when you go to the university, they're going to just brainwash you. So they try to portray the science as basically false, as evil, as purposefully trying to disprove God. And they almost give them that reality of being anti-intellectual. So they want their kids to be anti-intellectual, which is really sad because we have nothing to be afraid of. We should be encouraging our kids that battle doesn't exist as people like to portray it on both sides. And in fact, there's no scientific discovery that would ever shake our faith. And in fact, we need to be engaging our kids into science, into STEM, into things like that, because I believe at the end, it points more and more to God. So that's the first myth I want to point out. And this actually, if people want to investigate it more, read a little bit into the history of science. The second false fact, and this might strike you a little bit, okay? All knowledge is in the Bible, okay? That's a wrong fact. That's a wrong fact. The Bible doesn't contain all knowledge. The Bible contains truth. Everything in the Bible is true. But the Bible doesn't contain all knowledge. So if you think of knowledge as knowledge, okay, there is a lot of knowledge that is outside of the Bible. The Bible is God's special revelation that is given primarily for a specific purpose. As everyone was talking about, like when we even study the Old Testament history, we realize the Old Testament history, the historians do write things, and other things they don't write them. And you would say, well, this is supposed to be history. They are supposed to write everything. And the reality, that's not the case. When the Old Testament historians are writing something, they're writing it for a specific purpose. So they're selective. Same thing when you look at the Bible. Okay, we can't really say that Genesis 1 and 2 is a pure scientific text to tell us the how and when and all that. It is giving us clearly the answer of why. Okay, it's clearly giving us the answer of purpose. It's clearly giving us a lot of theological answers. But if we are going to try and say that all knowledge is included in the Bible, I think we have to be careful about that. The Bible includes all truth, but truth and knowledge are not necessarily, the same. The scope of knowledge is, far bigger than that. And that's actually one thing that we start to realize when we think of how God reveals himself. We know that he reveals himself in the Bible, that's called special revelation, and he reveals himself in nature, that's called natural revelation. And in fact, one of the things for us, how we can deduct the existence of God is just looking and studying nature and how intricate it is. So that's a second, I'm not calling it a myth, but it's a false fact. We have to be careful of that. I think a third one is that science is based only on reason. A lot of sometimes scientists, especially militant scientists and secular scientists, try to say, well, you guys in the Bible deal a lot of things based on faith, okay? But we in science, we're based on reason. So you know what? Reason wins. Faith, you guys believe in fairy tales. You guys remember like that? One of the reasons why people were turning away against Christianity and saying, well, I don't believe in fairy tales because I have reason. That's actually not the case. There is a lot of faith in science as well. like, I'll give you an example. As scientists, for example, study the Big Bang and study the beginning of time and space, and a lot of scientists are struggling with the with trying to understand, okay, what was, how was, what came before the Big Bang, what initiated, what triggered the Big Bang. A lot of scientists are coming up with many theories, okay, of what could have predated the Big Bang that would try to exclude God. That's well and dandy, that's fine. These theories are far beyond what I can even understand, because a lot of it is related to, cosmology and things that I have not studied. But the reality is that when you start to listen to people who are looking at this, they'll tell you their belief in a model that excludes God from the beginning of existence is based on their own faith. They have a faith that this transcended being called God will not exist. So we have to find a reason why existence happened. Why does this world happen? So you start to realize that scientists base a lot of their work, when they put a hypothesis and they go about to prove it, they're actually basing all their work based on a faith inside them that their hypothesis is the correct one. So this is a complete myth. And this actually, by the way, this is one of the main things that somebody like Richard Dawkins was attacked by philosophers and philosophers of science, because they came and told him, is like, you're saying the faith-based guys or the people believing in the Bible are basing all their fairy tales based on faith. You got to realize something. You have a lot of faith. You have a faith. You've never proven that God doesn't exist. In fact, you have a faith called the atheistic faith. And there are some tenets on how that faith is based. So that's another very important point in philosophy of science that we have to realize, because sometimes our kids and our youth, as they go into college and they start to think, they start to use reason, they come back sometimes with this belief or assumption that truth is owned only by the university, by scientists, because they only prove what can to be proven by reason. What we as, faith-based, entity, as the church or as the Bible, is based on just, I force it down your throat, is like, believe it, you got to believe it because I told you so. And that's not the case. So we have to be very careful as we're teaching our kids what is the role of reason and what is the role of faith, and what is the limits on reason. A lot of scientific philosophers are starting to talk about this. There is a limit on on reason, even from a human perspective. So that's a third kind of false fact. A fourth one, which I know this one will get very, very heavily debated. Okay, the assumption that the Bible has only one interpretation. I can tell you for 15 years, I've been studying this. There is not one single interpretation for the biblical text. And some people will struggle with that. Some people would have, like, well, that doesn't make sense, because the Bible, the word of God has to mean one thing. And that's not the case, because the word of God is so deep. And here's one thing, believe it or not, that some of the church fathers actually talked about this, because they said if it was only one interpretation and one meaning, the first one who reaches that interpretation, there is really no reason for people after him to study, to think, to pray, to contemplate, to meditate. If that one meaning was reached right when the book was written 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago as the Old Testament, then why are we even trying to study it and understand it? The Word of God is live and timeless. We look at it a lot of times, those timeless facts, but as we are gaining more knowledge about many other things in our life, as it is from science. I can tell you, and now if we talk specifically about what Genesis 1 and 2 is, it doesn't have one meaning, but I can tell you, for example, what doesn't it mean? It is amazing to me, and we can talk about it in a different session, how the book of Genesis 1 and 2, if there's anything missing out of it, is the ancient mythical language. You look at all the ancient mythology of the Egyptian, the Sumerian, the Babylonian, the Greek, okay? And you look at the time that it came out, which is like a millennium before Christ, okay? That's when all these mythologies started to circulate. One thing I started to realize is that as you look at Genesis 1 and 2, it is anticlimactic. It's almost like as if you compare the Harry Potter movie with all its drama and all its story to a newspaper article that is just stating facts. And that's one thing that when scholars look at Genesis 1 and 2, how uniquely different it is. They're looking at it when it came out, 1,000 years before Christ, 1,500 years before Christ. And they're saying if Moses was trying to copy the ancient mythology around him, he did a very bad job, because the ancient mythology was always that creation was part of a cosmic war. There was a battle between gods. There was a lot of sex. There was a lot of blood. There was a lot of loser gods. There was a story. But when you look at Genesis 1, it is actually, if I might say, I learned this from one of my teachers, it is actually very boring. It's basically, in the beginning, God created, God said, let there be light, so there was light. Let there be, let the land separate, so the land separated. Let the land sprout plants, so the land sprouted plants. There was no story. So in fact, to me, one of the things that is very unique about Genesis 1 and 2, that it's very different than all the origin stories of its time. And it was really hard to me to believe or to understand how Moses would write that unless it was revealed to him. So if one thing I can tell you from studying Genesis 1 and 2, that it's against or different than all ancient mythological stories. However, saying that, if you're talking about Genesis 1 and 2, well, is it 10,000 years? Did Adam evolve? Did Adam, was created as is? I always give this analogy, okay? You know how you got a train, you've got two tracks. One of the rules about the tracks is that for the train to move, those tracks have to be exactly parallel to each other. So just imagine, for the sake of analogy, you've got one track, which is your biblical interpretation, how you're interpreting, let's say the days of Genesis. And on the other track, you've got your scientific interpretation. If you believe that a day, in your own biblical understanding, a day is 24 hours, your scientific interpretation has to match that. So then you're going to come and say, well, I believe the universe is only 10,000 years. The possibility of it being 14, 15 billion years is completely false. All what these scientists are saying are spreading our lies, okay? Your scientific interpretation has to match your biblical interpretation. The problem, as you look at the current lay of the land, this is it. There's so many different interpretations of, how does the Genesis days fall out? How does Adam fall out? Was he instantaneous just like that, or was he evolved? And the reality is that for any interpreter who's interpreting the Bible, their understanding of nature has to match what their understanding of the Bible is. And that becomes very tricky. You know why? Because if you are limiting yourself to a very narrow interpretation of the biblical text, let's say a young earth creationist, you are forcing yourself and everyone who follows you to reject, the scientific, I won't say scientific dogma. I don't consider a dogma, because science changes. Science, evolves by itself. So what we knew 100 years ago is different than what we know right now. So in general, it is very important to realize that those come together. When you look at the lay of the land, you've got the evolutionist who doesn't believe in God. You've got the theistic evolution who believes in evolution 100%, but believes that it was all managed by God. Believe it or not, there's some very top-notch scientists who are very devout Christians. I would say that somebody like Francis Collins is in this camp. He believes in evolution as a science, but he doesn't believe in it that it's random. He believes that it's orchestrated by God. He believes that it's all 100% promised or guaranteed by God. And then you've got the creationists. You've got the old earth creationists who believe that the universe could be 14 billion years, 15 billion years. But on the other side, when it comes to man, to Adam, he was created instantaneously 10,000 years ago, the biblical Adam. And then you've got the young earth creationists who believe that, like existence as we know it is only 10,000 years. So they would discount significantly anything related to cosmology, to the Big Bang and whatnot. So you can see that like all these camps, those three camps, do claim that they're Christians. And by the way, they're Catholic, Orthodox, and evangelicals in all those three camps. I can't say that one camp is more than the other. Yes, the young earth creationist tends to be a little bit more the fundamental evangelicals. And that's one of their struggles with science. That's one of their struggles with anthropology, with the dinosaurs. That's one of their biggest troubles. But that's how they look at things. So then moving on, and as I said, I can't really answer all the questions in half an hour, but has science answered everything? Well, it's answered some. There's been a lot of research about the Big Bang, how the Big Bang is the beginning of existence, the beginning of life, and how the complexity of life has come through the last 500 million years, okay, all the way to what they think of as the beginning of man. This idea of the sequence of organisms, potentially transitional from one to the other, this idea that the fins evolved to the feet. So there's a lot, and this is kind of the stuff that they teach in our schools. They teach, so my kids, when they took biology in high school, that's the standard teaching. You have to realize that science looks at this and says, well, that's a proof. To me, it's a piece of evidence. There is a lot of things against me saying, well, this proves that humans evolved from, premature creatures. But that's how scientific thinking goes. They look for, logical, methodical proofs. Okay. Is it a proof of everything? Not really. I think one of the biggest things is the genetic similarity. And to me, is like, as I said, I don't want to spend a lot of your time, but to me, I think one of the biggest challenges, and from a creationist perspective, I think we have to figure out also, if we're going to believe that Adam was created instantaneously, then we have to do more research. Why would God choose such kind of genetic similarity? Okay, why would the chimps, gorilla, and orangutan, there would be about a 95% similarity in our genetic composition with those? To me, actually, what is very unique is not necessarily the 95% similarity, but actually, how does a 5% difference in our genetic composition explain the magnitude of difference between us and chimps? So what does that tell me? That tells me that actually there had to be an intelligent agent flipping on the switches, so that 5% explains how different we are from chimps. So the 95 similarity is great. A lot of scientists look at the 95% similarity and say, well, that proves that we and chimps have the same ancestor. But to me, well, how do you then explain that 5% to account for everything else? I think the pseudogenes is probably, that's where a lot of the interesting research comes into play. And to be honest with you, if there's a couple of areas in the theory of evolution that I find very unique as a scientist, I think the pseudogenes are one of them. And the pseudogenes are very interesting because what is a pseudogene? A pseudogene basically is a gene that was functioning, okay, in a species, and then it got defective because one of the amino acid bases got flipped. It's very interesting that when you look at human chimps and orangutans, all three of those organisms, okay, they have the vitamin C gene, the gene that codes for vitamin C. They have it, but it's defective. There is a mutation. And that mutation is the same between the human and the chimp. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why, for example, we as human beings have to take vitamin C. That's why otherwise we get scurvy. So it becomes very interesting, and they're starting to find more and more of those pseudogenes. I think the answer from, if I'm a more creationist and I believe that Adam was created as is, there has to be a certain scientific reason why God, in his wisdom, created us, okay, with those defective genes. And why is it like the chimp? Is it something that is related to the environment that we live in, the way that we process, the way our metabolism? The reality is that when it comes to science, we don't know everything, but we have to understand when our kids bring these arguments to us and come to us and say, well, I learned this in college, okay, and this to me is a proof that humans and chimps share the same ancestry. We should not denounce this as, well, this is a lie. This is pseudoscience. They're trying just to fool us and belittle the Bible. No, I think we have to listen to them and understand, but also tell them there is a limit to how much science knows. And that's where, the evolution of man comes. There are a lot of challenges to the current evolutionary theory. And here's one thing I also would always tell people: don't denounce everything, okay? Because when you denounce everything, you're making us as the church be truly anti-intellectual. I think the church should be very critical, but not anti-intellectual. I think there's a very big difference between being critical and being anti-intellectual. There are challenges to the current evolutionary theory. I think one of the biggest challenges is, how did life begin on Earth? I think this is one of the most amazing things. It's very interesting when you look at most scientific books, science books about the origin of life on the Earth. They always kind of cite this Urey Miller experiment, which, hey guys, Chicago, this was done at the University of Chicago. So this is University of Chicago, very famous. I think it was almost 1940 or 1950. So it's been around for quite a while. And in this, what they basically did is that they had, so this is kind of like almost like a concoction of organic substances, and they take completely out everything, including oxygen, and then they put an electric spark, and they come out at the end with some amino acids. And this has been touted almost for the last 50 to 60 years as the explanation of beginning of life. Needless to say, there's some very key caveats in this test. Well, who made this test? It was not chance. It took scientists to make this test, to orchestrate all the criteria for the test. And then also the fact that you have vacuum, not oxygen, makes it really hard, because actually there's never, ever been a time when the atmosphere of the Earth was void, completely void of oxygen. So if that's your explanation of how life began, there's a lot of holes in it. Needless to say, and I think that one of the most amazing, and this is where now a lot of scientists are coming and saying, we don't have the full answer, because you're thinking about evolution, when you've got a genetic material that then is being transmitted from one generation to the other, and it's evolving. But the question becomes, how now, there's called a theory of information. How did that genetic information come? And he started to realize this chicken or egg, which is basically that for you to have a genetic code, you have to have DNA and RNA. To make DNA and RNA, you have to have enzymatic proteins to make the DNA and RNA. But then to make the enzymatic proteins, you need DNA and RNA to code it. You guys realize very quickly the chicken and egg problem, okay? So it's becoming right now a huge point of debate. And that's, I think, where the finger of God is really pointing, is that the issue is not in the genetic transmission. The issue is actually, how do you get to code for information? It takes an intelligent mind to code for information. And that's becoming one of the biggest areas of how people who believe in God are starting to look at science. But they're not looking at it as a point that actually they're denouncing science, but they're actually rather searching science more and more to look at these answers. I think there is a lot of evidence against mutation that in our best ability, when we as scientists force mutations, the result of it is actually a completely mutant, dysfunctional organism. We know very well, and Uncle Atif, as a physician, would tell you, most of when we talk about a mutation, we talk about it in a very bad sense, as a mutation that causes cancer. Uncle Atif, as an OBGYN, can tell you how much mutations cause problems in babies. When you look at science, when science applied random mutations, the results were mutants that couldn't survive. It's very different when you're a scientist, you are purposefully inserting a gene that is functional, okay, and you're inserting it somewhere. You are a rational, intelligent being. But when it comes to random mutations didn't bring out anything. In the interest of time, I'm gonna just, and this is something actually right now, like, mutations that have been seen have been more adaptation rather than actually a new species coming. I want to end this by going back a little bit into philosophy and theology. Because as the more and more I study this, I don't think the answer is exclusively in Genesis 1 and 2. I think the answer is also in how we study and look at Genesis 1 and 2. I, as a person, for example, if you look at Genesis 1 and 2, yes, you can take a literalist, 24-hour, young Earth creationist and believe that Earth is 10,000 years. That's fine. You can be a bit more in the middle, which I think our Coptic church is that, the universe could be ancient. But when it comes to the creation of man, we believe that the creation of man was special, instantaneous, a special creation, within the last 7,000 to 10,000 years. But you could be also a scientist, a Christian scientist, who believes in evolution as a scientific theory, and you believe that God oversaw that, and God created humankind with dignity, and the fact that humankind evolved from pre-existing semi-intelligent creature, it doesn't necessarily bother you. I would probably tell a scientist like this, I find it really interesting that you are able to keep your faith and your belief in science, I'll maybe tell him that the traditional interpretation of the church has not been like that for the last 2,000 years. I'll probably say from a patristic perspective, that was not what the church fathers necessarily believed. But also I can give him the benefit of doubt of this scientist and say, well, the church fathers didn't have for them the science. And a lot of these scientists like Francis Collins, who believe in evolution, would really, quote people like Origen, like Gregory of Nyssa, like Augustine, for example, and how they tackled, especially Augustine, how Augustine tackled the idea of science and natural revelation versus the biblical interpretation. But needless to say, I would say that for most part, for 2,000 years, that has not been the traditional Christian interpretation. Do I think that this scientist who believes in evolution and believes in God is a heretic? Do I believe he's going to lose in faith? I'm not God. But all what I can say is that that's not the traditional way the church interpreted it. Do I think that we need to do more studies and study more in the languages, in the biblical languages, in the understanding of how Moses would have written this? Yes. Do I believe that we need to do more science, because science and the evolution is not the theory of all, it's not the end of all. It's not the theory of everything. There's many, many questions that science has not answered. I think science has answered many questions on how, the mechanisms, how nature, how is described. And I think we have to be very mindful as our kids bring these, this understanding to us home. Science has not answered questions about why the way it is. And this is actually coming back to a very philosophical question. As a scientist, you can describe to me the Big Bang. You can give me a lot of cosmological scientific data about the Big Bang. But you really don't have any insight to why the way it is. Why is existence the way it is? Science has no input into the value of nature. And I find this very interesting, because if you're going to ask me, what does Genesis 1 prove? I will tell you, I don't think Genesis 1 proves that there were 24 hours in the day of creation. I don't think it proves in any way or shape that it's at 10,000 years. But what Genesis 1 proves to me, is that God created, and he, as God, gave value to that nature. He said it was good. He said at the end of creation of man, it was very good. So whether science discovers that it was through evolution or not, that's a different story. But the value of this creation, only the Bible has added this value. And that's something that now, as even people who are non-believers are reflecting on the meaning of existence, they're starting to realize that science has no answer to that. Science cannot tell them the meaning of existence. It takes a lot of faith to say that there's no meaning in nature. It's almost like, a nihilist or a fatalist. If you're looking at everything around you in terms of your existence, in terms of the universe, in terms of this earth, in terms of the intricacy of the human body, to then come at the end and say there's no meaning. It takes a lot of, faith to say, well, there's no meaning even to our human relationships. Extreme application of rational thinking robs life of the mystery that we enjoy. And that's something, as I said, I've been very surprised as I'm reading that the people who are pushing back against scientists right now are not actually the Christians. There are a lot of philosophers of science, a lot of people from actually Eastern religions who are starting to say that, being a militant atheist and putting everything and reduce it to its just mechanistic approach is robbing life of the mystery that we enjoy, the mystery that we all value in this. And let me end with actually a couple of philosophical questions. And that's where I'm going to end with. And I want you to actually think about it, because, as I said, I'm not a scientist. As a physician, yeah, I know a little bit about biology, but I'm not a scientist. So I can't really answer a ton of scientific questions. But to me, I've been very much attracted to this idea of the philosophy of how we think about what we think. This is a very interesting story. So when man landed on the moon, when Armstrong landed on the moon, at that time, the United States wanted to do something symbolic for actually the first man to land on the moon. So they asked a lot of presidents from the world to write almost like letters, or like, a small memo or letter, and they would leave it in a box on the moon surface. And then they made a gold olive tree branch, and they put it in this box. And the whole premise was that basically, if one day aliens come and find this, they would read about our civilization. They would read that we are, in peace. We're not here for war. And they would see this olive tree branch. And that got me thinking in a very kind of critical way. Well, how do we know the aliens are going to understand the significance of this message? The only reason why we as human beings understand the olive tree to become a symbol of peace is that we've gotten the message and the interpretation. So the olive tree in itself means nothing unless somebody interprets for us. And how I grow up to learn it is by somebody telling me that the olive tree is the sign of peace. So you start to realize that the existence of a message is meaningless unless somebody interprets it for you. So what if I told you that the universe, with all its science, with all the discovery we're finding at this point, whether inside us or outside of us, is completely meaningless for us? We can even understand it unless God reveals to us why this world is like this. And I think that's what the Bible is about. The Bible may not give us the interpretation of the message of how or the scientific details, but it for sure answers for us the why. So I think very much like this olive tree, unless somebody is interpreting the message, we have no way of decoding it. And to me, our existence in this world, science is unable to decode for us the why and to where. Okay, that's what they call the origin and the teleology, the end. Science is unable to answer that for me. That message is unreachable by science. Yet that message in its depth, that's Genesis 1 and 2. That is Genesis 1 and 2. So as far as we can debate for so long about just 1 and 2 with our kids in terms of its scientific, I don't think that's what the answer is. I think the answer is that Genesis 1 and 2 is giving us the answer of why we exist and to where we're going. When God said he created us on his image and likeness, that is telling me where I came from and where I'm going to go. And then the last thing I want to leave you with is, it goes back to maybe the slide I was telling you about, that, there's not single one interpretation for the Bible. And some people get offended at this because well, how do you know the truth? Well, maybe that's the point. The point that God is giving us a message that is so deep, the message that is so timeless, a message that can be lived in depth. For me, when I look at current day science and the amazing discoveries they're finding and the intricacies and the 1 over 120 millionth of a chance of our existence is that sharp, to me it gives even extra meaning to the biblical account. So it begs the question, why are we still studying the Bible? Why are we still debating this? Why are we still studying science? And the answer is very simple. When when we were kids, when we were trying to solve a mathematical problem, if the professor gave us the answer right away, have we learned anything? Have we grown? Have we increased in anything? And the answer is no. You'll start to realize that growth comes from asking the question. Growth comes from facing the challenge of the enigma in the question and trying to bring it up in terms of studying and discussing. And you start to realize that's where the growth comes. It doesn't come when somebody gives you the answer right away. And I think I would apply the same thing to our lives at this point. We have to keep studying the Bible. We have to keep studying this text. We have to keep studying our existence, our scientific knowledge, because I believe the growth is always going to be behind asking the question, which is, this is amazing, God created it this way, but still why? Where are we going? What are we doing with the knowledge that we have gained, especially in this day and age when we're facing so many challenges? So I believe that the growth is behind asking the question. And I believe, just like he said, God said, I came to give them life and to have it more abundantly. I believe this abundance is to be discovered scientifically. I believe this abundance is to be discovered medically. I love the idea that we are now advancing medically to stages that are unheard of, 50, 60 years ago. Actually 40 years ago, just 40 years ago. So if you think of the history of civilization as 8,000 years, okay, from the first time when they found ancient civilization, within the last 40 years, we've done things that 8,000 years has never reached. The fact that within half an hour, can save somebody from a heart attack is mind-boggling to me. I think this is abundance. This is abundance of intelligence that God gave us. But I think also God humbles us, where you find a virus is putting the whole world to a complete halt. I think the virus calls us, for humility, but it doesn't call us to become anti-intellectual or against science. I think the abundance that God has given us is a big calling to understand our life, to understand our existence, and to realize that truth is one. Truth is not divided. It's not necessarily it's science against faith. We reach truth by approaching both. There's some areas where both will give us reinforcement, but some areas where, some questions are answered uniquely by one of them. So I hope within this period of time, I don't think I've answered many questions about, well, does the Bible prove to us, it's 10,000 years or it's 16 billion years? I don't think I wanted to answer that. Rather, I wanted to answer how we think about the biblical text, how we think about our existence, how we think about science, and how can we help our kids as they process these things. If any one of you, I know many of you have raised kids and grandkids. The reality is that we don't want them to be doubting God because of what they learn in school, but also we don't want them to take everything that is given to them uncritically. We need to teach them to become critical, and just understanding these would help us to do that. Thank you for your time. I think I've taken a lot more than what I expected. So thank you, Abuna Pavlos, Abuna Theodore, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. George. This was very enlightening, and I understand, of course, that it's a very broad topic, and I think people probably have maybe specific questions. If maybe you can touch upon some of that. So one of the questions.
Absolutely. And I think I love the questions to be specific, because I didn't know who has a specific question. So I prefer to answer the questions in a specific way. So absolutely, I think that's a good way.
Okay, so here's one question. How do you respond to people who don't believe in the Bible?
It's a great question. So in some sense, I don't argue that from the beginning in terms of actually the Bible, because it's hard to force an argument from the Bible itself to make people believe in the Bible. That's kind of a circular argument. The way that I look at it is actually, I start from the beginning, is that let's argue, is there a possibility, okay, that a rational, transcendent being, super intelligent being would exist? And just looking at our, natural arguments, cosmological arguments, the moral argument, many other arguments, kind of bringing up the idea that the possibility of a supernatural, intelligent, rational being can potentially explain our existence. Because now we're asking the questions like, okay, well, I can't prove it to you from the Bible, but I can look at our existence, and I can look at natural, data from our existence. And I think the idea of even almost like the transcendence of the soul, there are a lot of metaphysical arguments at this point, and actually neurobiological arguments, which are unbelievable in terms of the existence of the soul, the existence of transcendence beyond matter. The argument goes as follows: if I can put a possibility that this would be the case, then a supernatural rational being reveals himself, talks, communicates. We are rational beings, correct? We communicate. A big part of our existence depends on communication. Okay, we impart meaning by communication. So if you take by the analogy of our existence, okay, there is a possibility that this rational being would exist. So that would be a beginning argument. A second argument would be that the Bible has a lot of historical and archaeological facts that have been very well documented. So I would say, if such kind of archaeology and history, the historicity of Christ is beyond doubt at this point. The historicity of his resurrection, the historicity of his crucifixion is beyond doubt. The resurrection has a lot of arguments how it can argue the historicity of that. But in essence, if you look at the Old Testament and New Testament, there is a lot of argument of its historicity. That would be a way to start bringing the discussion. Does it prove that the Bible is truthful? No. But for me, I think those are some arguments in that direction.
Okay, lovely. And I have like several other questions here. I'm gonna see in terms of time. Okay, this looks like from someone who's really reading very well on these topics. Do you think particle physics and mass research like the Higgs boson can really validate how the universe and humans were formed? And understanding that, what contradicts the belief in the, sorry, and in understanding that, what contradicts the belief in the existence of God? I personally am not an expert on the scientific topic that he's mentioning, but I don't know if you can speak to that.
To be honest with you, this is an area, because now you're getting into very deep physics, and you know that anyone who chose to study biology doesn't really understand a lot in physics. So I'll put it that way. But needless to say, I can definitely, maybe later on, I'll be happy to share my email. I can refer, whoever is interested in that into actually more specialized books in this part. Okay. But the reality is that the more and more they discover, I think they realize the expansive nature of this universe makes the possibility of intelligence. I think this is one thing that a lot of people right now in physics are starting to realize: the intelligence behind the universe. And it becomes really hard. How can you assign this intelligence to something as abstract as the universe itself? Okay, is it a self-existing universe that is that intelligent? And a lot of the arguments right now are coming to like, well, this intelligence has to have behind it an intelligent mind to bring it to fruition. Okay, so I don't know enough about it, Yabuno, but I'd be more than happy to refer some books.
Okay, and another question. Is the Coptic Church interested in studying biblical symbolism and how or if they are true?
So I don't know exactly what is meant by symbolism, okay? And I hope maybe they can elaborate a little bit on this question. Symbolism, if you think about symbolism in an Old Testament fashion, the Coptic Church actually was our church fathers were very, very heavily into studying symbolism in the Old Testament. And that symbolism carried on a lot of things, whether it is in terms of the typology, the allegory, the numerology. So the short answer is like, actually, from the church history perspective, that's the case. If that's what you mean by symbolism, maybe a follow-up question would be helpful there, Abuna. Like, what kind of symbolism are we talking about?
Okay, I'll see maybe if they write something. I'll have a quick question myself, if you don't mind me asking.
Sure, Abuna.
We hear about okay, actually someone says here, I think they're commenting their follow-up, Bible symbols and figurative language in both the Old and New Testament.
So our Coptic Church is the leader, okay? I'll put it this way.
School of Alexandria.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like, this actually is the textbook for studying the figurative language in the Old Testament. Our church fathers, Origen, Didymus the Blind, a little bit in, Athanasius and Cyril, okay, but those were the founding fathers of how this was studied. Yeah, it was taken on maybe after that a little bit more stronger by somebody like Gregory of Nyssa, but somebody like Origen and Didymus the Blind were the founding fathers of that kind of study.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my question was, like, you mentioned this idea. I think a lot of us have this idea, almost like it's an either-or proposition. Either it's the literalist 24-hour, 7-day week thing, or completely science and all this stuff is fairy tales. So when you brought up this idea of theistic evolution, I'm not sure how many people in our community are familiar with that concept. And isn't it almost a contradiction in terms, because for someone as a layman like myself who hasn't studied evolution or anything, when you hear the word evolution, there's always the idea of, random processes, natural selection, and then we say theistic, and it's almost like, well, isn't that kind of a contradiction? How are we how is that even a possibility? If you can comment on that a little bit.
That's a great question, Abuna. So there are a couple of different answers, and I would probably encourage people who are very interested in learning this about it, because I think I'm not saying that that's actually the answer to all. As I said, if I would really think about our traditional church interpretation, it would be hard to rhyme with theistic evolution. But I would also say that there are very, very premier scientists who are very notable in the country that would hold to this. And I would probably refer you to a website called Biologos to look at the publications. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, has a wonderful book called The Language of God that he talks about it. But in essence, Abuna, there's a couple of things. First of all, when you think about evolution, when Richard Dawkins is talking about it, Richard Dawkins takes evolution to its extreme, philosophical extreme, which basically he thinks that evolution explains the origin of existence, explains the development of existence, and explains also the purpose of existence in terms of the randomness that is completely governed by complete random. So basically he's saying that we could have not have evolved because it was completely random. Somebody like Francis Collins would take this, say like, you know what, actually, you can't really say that from the science. That takes philosophy and atheism as a faith to say that. Because the science, actually, there's nothing in the science can tell you specifically that. From Francis Collins' perspective, he would tell you that he thinks of evolution as a mechanism that explains how the genetic material are transmitted and changed. Yes, there is a bit of randomness, but the overall randomness is controlled. And he gives the example as follows, okay? When you, and it's kind of not the best example, but it does make sense sometimes. When you are in a gambling, like in Vegas, you're gambling, okay? You have a table, okay, that gamble, and that table, you as a person, you're gambling, but the owner of the casino is almost like they know all the possibilities, and they know at the end how it's like, you know what, it has to be a zero-sum game. So there is randomness within the game, but there is the overseer of the game who knows all the possibilities and knows all the potentials and can control everything within that. So from his perspective, God as an omnipotent and an omniscient God knows exactly, because also his foreknowledge extends to eternity, knows exactly how every single step will happen. And even though from an individual perspective, I as an individual, there is randomness in how I receive my genes and whatnot. And now you can talk about I as humanity, but from God's perspective, him being overseeing that, okay, he knows and he can guarantee. He starts it, he oversees it as a mechanism, and then oversees it at the end as the purpose, okay, of how mankind is now evolving to a point that it knows and transcends and knows God. The question becomes, well, how do you rhyme this? But from his perspective, it kind of says, well, that actually speaks of God in an amazing way, because the process all of a sudden is far more complicated, you see what I'm saying, than just instantaneously. Like for somebody like Francis Collins, going through the intricacies of science for God to do this over many, many years shows how complex shows how much he has control over a complex matter, rather than, doing it, over an instant. I've heard a very interesting analogy, Abuna, and I'm going to share with this analogy. And this is an analogy also maybe to bring things to your mind, like to how they think. So somebody who's like a theistic evolutionist who believes that evolution is just a mechanism overseen by God, started by God, promised, the outcome is promised by God, it's not random, would say that just imagine that God is like a very, very fine painter who does paint with oil. Okay, anyone who's done oil painting on canvas knows very well that to make an oil canvas, you got to do several layers, because actually your shadows and how you're showing the details are based on how, like, almost like multiple layer after layer, and you're painting, this whole universe, 16 billion years, this Earth, 4.5 billion years, and you're doing this absolutely intricate painting, and you're waiting until the end for your crown jewel, who's humanity. Humanity is your crown jewel, and you're this amazing fine-tuned painter. Could you imagine this fine painter who uses oil and just uses all his tools and is giving you a masterpiece, would then cut and paste a picture from a magazine, literally find a magazine, and cut and paste and put it in the center of his picture. And this, theistic scientist will tell you, theistic evolution will say, I don't think so. From his perspective, if he believes that God is this master designer who designed the universe from the Big Bang till now and is guaranteeing its end, if he thinks of him as this master painter, from his perspective as a scientist, it doesn't bother him that God would use evolution as a mechanism to orchestrate the coming of man. I do believe, Abuna, that there are some theological challenges to theistic evolution in terms of evolution of man from like semi-intelligent creatures. I think there are some theological challenges, especially in the Pauline epistles. I think with Romans and Corinthians, I think there's some challenges there. But needless to say, if you go and read in Biologos, they have some very talented and amazing theologians who have answers. Do I think these answers are the traditional answers that we hold on as to a church? I'll tell you, no, they're not. But I have to be honest with you. Sometimes when I find youth who are struggling with their faith to the point that they're completely losing their faith in God because of, how much they've been indoctrinated with atheistic science, I offer them sometimes these, not necessarily to, get them away from orthodoxy, but in almost like a last resort to tell them, I don't think you need to lose your faith if you're so gung-ho about evolution. Okay, I hope you understand that evolution could be a mechanism, but it doesn't. Evolution is very different than evolutionism as a philosophy of life and philosophy of existence. So that's how they would look at it. And I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so just as a follow-up, so someone asked, so don't most traditionalist churches denounce macroevolution, speciation? And if so, wouldn't that shoot down the idea of theistic evolution? I think you sort of answered that, but if you want to add anything.
Yes, but also I want to say the answer to that is far wider than that. So I can tell you, for example, within the Catholic tradition, evolution and theistic evolution is very, very, very prominent. In fact, I can say that it's far more prominent. It's more than 50% of Catholics do believe in theistic evolution. Within the Orthodox tradition, I would tell you that the Russian Orthodox tradition would be very much in favor of something like theistic evolution. Within the evangelical, maybe less. I think evangelical, you probably realize from just looking at politics, there are two arms of evangelicals. There are the fundamental evangelicals, and then what's called the mainline Protestants, like the Methodists, the Lutherans, the United Methodists, etc., the Presbyterians. Those would be, they would be okay with theistic evolution. So the answer to your question, do most traditional churches renounce macroevolution? The answer to your question would be no. I think if you're asking specifically about the Coptic Orthodox Church, I would tell you absolutely yes. I don't think the Coptic Orthodox understanding would be compatible with something like that.
Okay, another question. I think these are like sort of three questions that I think they're kind of related. And in my mind, they seem to be related to the ideas of the Book of Enoch and maybe some of the stuff related to maybe the TV show Ancient Aliens and stuff like that. but so there's this idea that, we hear about Enoch who walked with God, but why wasn't the Book of Enoch not included in the Bible? And it seems to have a lot of the details about the past and the present. And what is your interpretation about the advanced civilizations that might have existed on Earth a long time ago? And then the idea of the sons of God and the daughters of men, as referenced in Genesis before the flood in chapter 6 and all that. So just for the purpose of time, I sort of combined like three questions all in one, because I also want to be cognizant of everyone else's time, and there's still several other questions as well. So if you can sort of...
I would make it just very brief, Ibn. I think that, first of all, in terms of the ancient civilizations, I don't like, to be honest with you, that's a question of archaeology and a question of science. If archaeology is, finds something to that matter, I think we look at it with archaeological data. I think the Bible itself is a little bit silent to that. The Book of Enoch is a very controversial book. I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of the churches do not accept it as canonical, except for the Ethiopic. There's a lot of reasons that's beyond the scope of this talk, but in general, even within the traditional Judaic tradition, the Book of Enoch was probably one of the less accepted. It is definitely full of a lot of apocalyptic elements that are not necessarily in sync with the rest of the biblical accounts. The issue of the sons of God as angels cohabitating with men, it's an interesting thing, because that actually, there are some scholars that believe, even from the canonical books, that is the case. And even one of the church fathers, Clement of Alexandria, believed in that. So I don't think you need to go to the book of Enoch to make that. It is the less traditional interpretation, of the sons of God, the more traditional interpretation, and the most current interpretation that actually those were sons of Seth, not angels. But needless to say, I don't think we need to quiver over that. The bottom line for the book of Enoch, with all my respect to the Ethiopic church, there is a lot of controversial elements to it, and it's hard for me to build theology and dogma and understanding on it.
Okay. Another question. Some people may inherit the religion of their families rather than coming to the conviction of the religion by themselves. This may lead one to doubt and want to find truth. When they do start the journey to truth, what criteria should they use to find truth? What advice would you give?
That's a really good question. I think the reality is that as you look at truth, I think there are some wider circles of truth that are not exclusive to the church or to the Christian faith. Like, for example, if I say that there is a transcendent, rational, intelligent, almighty being, that's not exclusive to the church. Yes, my understanding of that being, my understanding of the attributes of that being is very different than, for example, the Islamic tradition or the Judaic tradition. But let's say that we're just, the belief in this transcendent being, that is something that I think is a universal truth that we can agree with other faiths in. I think within that, trying to understand that our Lord Jesus Christ is the unique and supreme manifestation of God's love, I think that's maybe unique with our faith. And I think trying to bring that and balance that out was like, well, it's just like C.S. Lewis said, either you think of him as a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. And you would have to come to that conclusion. I think that one thing that, as people come from different faiths and different backgrounds, I do believe that we have to be mindful of how they come in terms of trying to celebrate what is universally true. I think there is a lot of commonality at this point with understanding the uniqueness of humanity. I don't believe we need to argue about the image and likeness of God just from a Christian perspective. I think the Jewish faith believes in that. The Islamic faith believes in that. I think even within Eastern spirituality, they believe in the uniqueness of human existence. So I think as somebody joins the Christian faith, we have to celebrate with them what was universal about our understanding of our existence, but then try to emphasize then what is unique about the Christian faith. I think this idea that we cannot be saved in terms of our knowledge of who God is and who's his love and what is his love, except through the person of Christ. Mm-hmm. I cannot reach God's love except through the person of Christ and except through the church. So standing from common ground with somebody who's coming into the faith, because a lot of times I've seen this case, the more and more sometimes we push, the more and more they struggle also with their own family. We have to understand that they're struggling with, like, okay, well, my family still is not seeing that. Okay. And celebrating that universal faith and coming to what is unique in Christianity, I think would be a good way to start the conversation. I don't know if that answers the question. I think it's a very good question.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. So because of the time, I'm going to ask two questions. One, like what I sort of perceive to be on two different angles of the evolution creation debate. And we're probably going to have to end it there because it is getting closer to 9:30. And I don't want to go too long, although this could probably go all night. So on one end of the scale, when we talk about our belief in creation, how do we fit the dinosaurs, the Neanderthal, and all that stuff about the ape men and all that sort of stuff? How do we fit that into our biblical account of creation? And I think that's a very common question we even hear from our kids when you give them the creation story. in Genesis or whatever in elementary school, the first question they usually ask is where did the dinosaurs fit into that story? So what would be a good response for that kind of question?
So I think dinosaurs are relatively, I won't say easier, but in a sense, I look at dinosaurs as part, if I think of the universe as, 15, 16 billion years, and I think of Earth itself as a planet, about 4.5 billion years, and, the several species, organisms that have come through that history. Dinosaurs, as they happened, they occurred as part of the natural history. That doesn't necessarily bother me. And if science, based on their scientific findings, and also, as I said, we have to be critical. I'm not saying we have to be anti-intellectual, but be critical what we get. Dinosaurs go where they go. I think Neanderthals and ape man and caveman are a little bit more challenging because basically the dogma of evolution, even as theistic evolution, Abuna, believes that these were part of the family. Okay, all right, because they call them Homo Neanderthals, and for us, we're Homo sapiens, but there was prior to us like Homo erectus, so they're part of that big family, okay, of Homo. I think that's a bit more challenging because if the evolutionist or the theistic evolutionist would say, well, those were part of the family or precursors, or actually, as some of those theories would propose that the Neanderthals intermarried with Homo sapiens, I think that's where the challenge comes. From my perspective, here's how I look at it. Caveman Neanderthals existed as an independent, semi-intelligent species, independent of Homo sapiens, who are the modern man, which I call biblical man. It's different than Adam. They existed and they were extinct at a period of time, 40 to 100,000 years ago, okay, for reasons that we as people, as science, we don't know. Were they precursors of biblical man? From my perspective, as a traditional interpretation, no, they were not, okay? Were they semi-intelligent? Well, we know very well that apes and dolphins and elephants have a sense of intelligence. You see what I'm saying? Like the fact of a creature being semi-intelligent doesn't necessarily take anything from how God created us as humanity. Were they the precursors? No. Were they part of the family? From my perspective, as a traditional interpretation, no. Do I have any need to deny their existence? Not necessarily. I take their existence as part of what science tells me they're existing. I think it's a bit of a leap of faith and jumping into conclusion that a scientist would connect the dots between Homo neanderthals, Homo erectus, to me as Homo sapien, as modern man. See what I'm saying? Because when you look at modern civilization has been found only within the last 10 to 15,000 years, which is compatible with biblical man. The genealogies, the times can vary a little bit. So, like, what is the most extreme for biblical man? 15,000 years, 10 to 15,000 years, that's acceptable. If you actually look at sociological studies and archaeological studies, that's when you see intelligence of civilizations coming up. So it's actually not out of question. Neanderthals, the majority of what Neanderthals were found were tools of hunting, tools and weapons of, to use as a weapon. If you actually look at modern monkeys and modern chimps, they can actually use, tools to hunt. They're known to do that. So having a semi-intelligent creature called the Neanderthal doesn't necessarily bother me, but it's not part of my ancestry as a human being. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
I think so. It just needs some digesting for me. That's
I guess the highlights of it as follows, Abuna. There's nothing against the biblical story that other creatures are semi-intelligent, because at this point, even our day and age, there are some semi-intelligent creatures, nowhere close to the humanity, but we know that they have some sort of intelligence, even emotional intelligence. Okay, dogs have emotional intelligence for that matter. You see what I'm saying? So having semi-intelligent creatures doesn't necessarily bother us as biblical account. Number two, them existing and being extinct, that is a question that I don't think necessarily the Bible is too much bothered about it. Just like the Bible doesn't record a ton of civilizations, the Bible doesn't record anything about the Mayans, about the native Indians. So the Bible is not concerned about them. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about it, there's really it doesn't really concern us. I think what concerns us, if a scientist would come and say the Neanderthal is a precursor or part of the human family, that's a different story.
Mm.
And that's a conclusion that they're making from connecting the dots their own way. I don't necessarily need to make those connection of dots, okay, from my own perspective. You see my argument?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so final question for the night. If we talk about evolution in terms of macroevolution or atheistic evolution, someone is asking, when we read the fathers, and an important rule we hear is that the consensus of the church fathers is infallible. And so when we read the church fathers, Saint Basil the Great, Saint Augustine, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and Saint Ephraim the Syrian, they talk about this idea of rejecting anything but the 24-hour day and giving dates to how old the earth is. They think about that. And, they'll also reject the idea of evolution. And it's, some people will trace it to, the Greek philosophers before Christ, Anaximander and so on. So how can we go against, if we today are talking about the idea of the possibility of evolution being an option, or interpreting Genesis not as a 24-hour day, isn't that going against the fathers? I think.
Well, wonderful question, but I would beg to differ. I do not believe there is a consensus among the fathers about the 24-hour period of Genesis. Out of the names that were mentioned, I think Basil is the most clear of them. I don't believe that Gregory of Nyssa, I don't believe that Augustine had a clear consensus about the 24 hours. For sure, Origen didn't. Whoever
Let me reread this part again, sorry, because I don't want to misquote the person who said this. Okay. So when we read the Holy Fathers, you will see that all who wrote concerning this topic attacked evolution and old earth creationism. So maybe there's an emphasis on the evolution piece as well. Examples are Saint Basil the Great, Saint Augustine, Gregory, Saint Ambrose, Saint John Chrysostom, and on a long list. Yeah.
I disagree with this comment, and I can actually point the person who asked that question to several books that actually tackle the question of this specific question in the patristic writings, and there are several excellent books in that case. I think if you want to be specific, I would tell you that Basil the Great was probably the most extreme in terms of the 24-hour. I think some of the other fathers didn't really, write with that extreme sense, but all of them agreed on the uniqueness of human creation. So I think probably a lot of them would have had problem with evolution of man, but when it comes to the 24-hour period, I respectfully disagree. I don't think there is anything within our church theology or our patristic tradition in terms of, if you quote, consensus, that would corner us into a young earth creation. I am actually personally, vehemently, adamantly against a young earth creation, interpretation. And I've got many reasons for that beyond this class or beyond this session. I still believe after everything, the creation of man was a special creation. I don't think we have all the answers from a scientific perspective, but I do respect where theistic evolution is coming from. It's very interesting that there's a lot of research right now within the patristic writings and theistic evolution. If you go to Biologos, some people are doing very interesting research in that part. But when it comes to 24-hour, I would strongly say I do not believe that there is a consensus within the church fathers that mandates us to believe in a young earth creation, 10,000 years.
But the evolution piece is probably more where they would hang their hat on this, because
absolutely, Abun. Evolution of man, it is very clear. So somebody like Saint Athanasius Saint Cyril, who didn't really touch base too much on it, but the way they talked about the uniqueness of man's creation would make their theology to some extent incompatible with the way they talked, actually, that Adam was the image of, or actually Christ's image was transposed on Adam, would make it incompatible. So that I would 100% agree with you. So when it comes to evolution of mankind, macro, and also here's the question, macroevolution is a different story, because also macroevolution, you can really say, well, we believe that actually, God created each species according to its own kind. That's what Genesis 1 is talking about. And I would tell you, like, I could agree with you in that. Okay, that maybe the subspeciation and the macroevolution, the church fathers would have given creation a bit more of its, God is hands-on. But in terms of rejecting the Big Bang cosmology, the 16 billion years, in favor of a narrow 10,000 years, I would point people to actually look into the history, that where you find that actually this almost like fundamental belief of a 10,000 year young earth creation did not rise in the history of tradition of interpretation until the end of 19th century, 20th century, with actually Seventh-day Adventists, believe it or not. So it was a very fundamentalist interpretation. When you look at the history of interpretation, that was not the predominant over many, many, many millennia, many centuries, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. George. Dr. You had a comment or a question. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
George, I really celebrate the way you have given this very difficult talk a way of everyone can actually continue to study and be scientist, and at the same time be a good, faithful individual and a good Christian. And this is really commendable, and I hope most young people will do that. 50 years ago, I was doing research with one of the top scientists in the world, but he was atheist. He was an avid atheist. He was a wonderful person, but he wouldn't have anything to do with religion. One of our colleagues died, and it was a very big shock to him and to all of us. And he took me and went to the funeral. It was in a Protestant church. I've never seen this man just melt over the question of death. And he was singing the hymns with great fervor. And I looked at him, and I found that he's almost crying while he is saying things like Amazing Grace and all that. And I think the question of God giving us the eternity in our hearts is something that love only can bring it to other people, that we have to treat everybody with love. And I want to leave you with this, because being somebody who worked in science, I can tell you I taught evolutionary processes in pregnancy and the embryos and baby's delivery and all that, and I totally believe it. However, there is a God who designed everything, who created everything, and the Bible is correct. And what you say, George, is extremely, extremely important for young people to continue to read and to study. And this is very, very good. I thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Uncle At. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Or maybe for Dr. George, that would be a sigh of relief, because we have been going very long.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for your time. And everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And I can see, like, from the 60-something people we are down to 20-something who've been able to go the whole distance. That's very much appreciated, especially at a Sunday night, and people probably have work tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us. So God willing, we will just prepare the recording, and we'll figure out a way, either we'll upload it or we'll have it somewhere where we can send a link for people to download if they so wish. We'll still figure that piece out with our tech people, George Caldas et al. And thank you so much once again, Dr. George, for this time. And I think you've sort of whet our appetite for another session at some point to tackle some of the other topics that we're touching on. Like, I would personally love to hear another thing more about the historical atom and human and civilization and the gene pool and all that sort of debate. That's a whole different thing, but we'll have to save that for another night. So, Buna Pavlos, if you're still here, would you like to pray for us? Because I think everyone's heard enough of my voice for one night.
We can tell Dr. Atif, please can pray for us.
Yeah.
Dr. Atif, اتفضل, go ahead and pray for us.
Doctor, pray for us.
Name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. We thank you, Lord, for the great love that you have showed us on the cross. You have brought us from the earth to heaven once more, and you've given us everlasting life. We thank you for all this, and we thank you for our minds. We thank you for our intelligence, and we thank you for Dr. George Tadros for the great session he made for us. And we ask you to put the eternity and the love of God in our hearts so that we can go on and wait for the day where we meet you in the eternity once more. We ask you to bless all of us and help us to be good disciples and good examples so that we can preach your word to everybody by our actions. In Jesus' name, and with the prayers of all your saints, hear us, O Lord, when we say, thankful, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as it is in heaven.